like to give a warm welcome to Lisa.
Thank you very much, both for being here this evening, and I hope I can live up to anywhere near the sort of expectations that Barbara's just set. I have known Barbara a while, as she's just pointed out, and she rang me up and said, "Oh, will you do a talk on chocolate?" And I think I was trying to say, I haven't done much research on chocolate recently, at which point she said, "That's great, thank you very much." So here I am. But I have worked in chocolate actually when I first left Reading when I left as an undergraduate. So I've got a bit of experience in the industry as well. And a lot of chocolate chemistry covers a lot of what we do in terms of sensory science, flavour chemistry, and actually quite a lot of what we do now in terms of food texture and rheology. Oh, you're right. So yes, I'm at Reading University, just a little tiny pocket bit of Reading. Reading actually set up as the Dairy Institute, and it was part really of the University of Oxford. So we've got a really long dairy history actually, and so we've still got our dairy farms, we've got our pilot plant. It doesn't quite look like the rather antiquated sort of dairy science bit on the top there now. It looks more like it's Edna there on the left hand side at the bottom. It looks a bit more like that, and we do still manage to do studies which I'm really proud of at Reading, actually. We have studies where we're changing the diet of cattle, and we're bringing the milk in from the farm into the pilot plant. We're processing that on the pilot plant, and we have a clinical unit where we can look at the effect actually on humans in the clinical unit, and we run the sensory, how we perceive it, and how consumers perceive it as well. So we really do kind of run from field right through to post-fork. I should have said Glenn here looks at the poo part, so he looks at the gut microbiota at the end of all that. So yeah, we are kind of pre-fork we're field to post-fork effectively. We became Department of Food and Nutritional Sciences finally in 2009. We used to be Food Science and Technology, and we had one nutritionist when I was at Reading as an undergraduate. We have an entire team of nutritionists now. So the kind of groups look a bit like this. We have the Food Research Group, which I'm in, and Sensory Science is in, the Food Microbial Sciences Group, and the Hugh Sinclair Unit of Human Nutrition. And we all work very much together and with the rest of the researchers really on site too. And my little bit is sensory and consumer science, where I particularly look at individual differences in sensory perception. That was one of the papers Barbara was mentioning earlier. So we vary in our genotype. So some of you, when you've got an excuse that you don't like rocket or Brussels, that's partly because you've got a different genotype. I say it's an excuse because the psychology part is about learning to like, and basically you have a barrier. And for some people, it's like going over a bigger hurdle than for other people because they're more bitter sensitive. It's not really a good excuse. You know, we all learn to like bitter things. But I do look at those individual differences, and I look particularly at perception and acceptability of foods designed for health. And I've got a particular research interest, which has been going on many years now, in terms of palatability of foods for older consumers. So actually how we change as we age, and how that affects our perception of food, and sometimes how that affects, well, it does affect our food choice, and how we can try to make that in a positive way. So that's kind of the sort of stuff I normally do rather than chocolate necessarily. But today, what am I going to talk about? So what is chocolate? And then the two main things about chocolate that make it so special, I suppose, from other foods. So one of those is it melts and it snaps completely differently to other foods, doesn't it? It's so crucial to chocolate that it has that characteristic. And it has an absolutely fabulous flavour. So where does that fabulous flavour come from? So those are the two things that I'm going to particularly focus on a little bit. And then I'll talk about the health implications. So the sort of negatives in terms of sugar and saturated fats, and also the positives in terms of polyphenols a little bit as well. And I'm going to leave you with the question really at the end of should we reformulate, with a bit of why I think whether we should or whether we shouldn't, and let's hear your opinions on that as we move on. So when talking about what is chocolate, I refer back to a colleague of mine from when I first did work in the industry, which is Steve Beckett, and he's an absolute expert in this field. So Steve Beckett in 1988 produced this book called Industrial Chocolate Manufacture and Use, and it is the book of chocolate that everyone uses. It's in, I think it's 5th edition now. So some of my early bits I'll take from Steve's book, and I did work with Steve. I had the fortune to do that when I first graduated. So when we think about chocolate, it's obviously cocoa originally, isn't it? So cocoa was actually a beverage historically in Mexico, and many people know that. And it was the Aztecs that really first cultivated the cocoa or the cocoa trees. And cocoa beans, right at that point, in terms of trying to then consume cocoa, were roasted straight away. So the first key point about cocoa and then chocolate is it's always been processed. There's a lot of hype at the moment about processing. You might be aware of that in the press. Lots of things that we shouldn't eat. Anything processed, we should eat it all raw. I've got some sort of opinions on that I'd be happy to share. There's lots of things that wouldn't do us a lot of good if we ate them completely raw, and we wouldn't be able to eat cocoa. You do need to roast it. And indeed, it's been roasted originally in earthenware pots and then ground, and that's how people used it as a drink initially. Columbus brought it over here to Europe, but it was the Spanish that perhaps developed it a little bit further to start with and sweetened it. And then it was the Dutch that really found the first point of how to make this beautiful liquid into something that was solid that we can consume. So really it was the Dutch that first seemed to have done that. And the key was, in order to make it solid, you had to play around with the cocoa butter, the fat that's actually in the chocolate. So they were the first ones to be able to extract that cocoa butter and therefore be able to change the properties and create solid chocolate bars. So we then could have a drinking chocolate that was sold as a drinking chocolate and actually had a lower fat content, and use the cocoa butter in the solid product to actually make the chocolate bar. So first, then let's come to fairly close to home, especially for some of you here. Then Fry's came along in the UK, and they used steam power at the time in 1847 to produce the first plain chocolate bars in Bristol in the UK. And around this time, into the Industrial Revolution, the Swiss were, we think, the first to develop the first milk chocolate bar. Why did it take that little bit of time to work out how to make a milk chocolate bar? Because now it's the most common, obviously the most popular chocolate bars tend to be milk chocolate. I'm personally a dark chocolate lover, but the milk chocolate is the bigger part of the market. The reason that it took a little bit of while is because milk comes obviously with a lot of water. So you've got to be able to dry the milk and drive out the water. Any of you that have ever cooked with chocolate, you know you use a bain-marie, don't you? You put your chocolate in a bain-marie over your saucepan of water to try to melt your chocolate. If you throw water into it, it's terrible, isn't it? It just clumps together like a cake mix. So you can't work with water in chocolate. You've got to be able to drive that water out. And that's why milk chocolate, to start with, was a bit of a challenge to create. Okay, so I'm talking about different chocolates already. So what is our legal definition of chocolate? Since 2009, Europe and UK have had the same regulations over chocolate. And I know we've Brexited, but we still currently have the same legislation over chocolate as well. Almost. There's some slight tiny exceptions, but the main parts are the same across the UK and Europe. So if you're looking at your plain dark chocolate on the left-hand side there, then that needs to have a minimum cocoa solids of 35%, whereas if it's milk chocolate, it's 10% lower than that at 25%. So those are your minimums. And those of you that are dark chocolate lovers there, you know you can buy your chocolates, can't you, at a higher and higher percent of cocoa at 70%, 85%, etc. cocoa. But that's your minimum to make it a dark chocolate. The actual cocoa solids it's got a fat part and a non-fat part to it, if you like. So the non-fat cocoa solids has also got a minimum. Again, it's that dark part of the chocolate, and it's higher, obviously, in a dark chocolate than a milk chocolate. It then has to have cocoa butter in it, and there are minimums for that. With a dark chocolate, that's a minimum of 18%. And then the white chocolate, it's the first time I've introduced that. So what makes a white chocolate? It's the cocoa butter. And so cocoa butter has quite a strong flavour associated with it as well. So a good white chocolate does have a good flavour coming predominantly from that cocoa butter. It doesn't obviously have any of that brown cocoa, any of the cocoa liquor. So it doesn't have all those lovely roast flavours that you get in your milk chocolate and your dark chocolate. Now, the other peculiar thing that was different between the UK and Europe was about the actual fats in a milk chocolate. So in a milk chocolate, you would expect most of the other things that aren't cocoa to be milk, wouldn't you? It says it in the name, milk chocolate. So there is a minimum percentage of milk fat that needs to be in there, of 3.5%, and a minimum in terms of milk solids, which is 14%. But you also have this little bit to play with, if you like, in terms of other fats that are allowed. So the UK has always had other fats in chocolate. And there was therefore an argument that went on for a long time in Europe about whether we were allowed to call our milk chocolate chocolate at all because it had these other fats in it. And eventually Europe agreed with us. And so the legislation, I think since 2009, has been through most of Europe, including the UK, that you can use this range of other fats in there up to 5%. So that's what's actually in there as a minimum. But let me talk now a bit more about these properties that I mentioned. So a chocolate bar obviously needs to be solid at room temperature, and that can be a problem in summer, can't it? We all know that if you get a particularly hot summer, or if you happen to live somewhere like Italy, then you've got a bit of a problem keeping your chocolate solid maybe in the summer. So it needs to be solid at room temperature, and it needs to melt rapidly at body temperature. So at 37 degrees, we want it to melt almost instantly and give us that kind of thick liquid in the mouth. So why can it do that? So it's really the combination of both the type of fat, the cocoa butter, and the processing that enable this to happen. So cocoa butter, I'll come back to its fat composition in a moment, but it's a poorer fat, relatively narrow in the type of fatty acids that are there, and its melting point. So it has quite a distinct melting point, which allows us therefore to have this lovely melt in the mouth. But again, it depends how you treat it. So the processing is really, really important to actually have that nice smooth melt, which I'll come back to. So we talk about the texture and the flavour. Where's this fabulous flavour coming from then? It's coming from the processing. So the cocoa flavour is heat generated. It's the reaction that any food scientist knows of as the most important reaction, I think, as a person who deals with flavour, and it's the Maillard reaction. So the Maillard reaction is the reaction that happens between reducing sugars, those are sort of sugars with a free oxygen group, if you like, on the end, and an amino acid, so the little bits of your protein. And you all know about Maillard reaction. If you put your slice of bread in the toaster in the morning and that goes brown, that's Maillard reaction. When you take a joint of meat and pop that in the oven, it's Maillard reaction. The same with coffee and cocoa. Particularly with coffee and cocoa, though, it's everything. I mean, coffee would not be coffee, chocolate would not be chocolate with cocoa without this beautiful sort of Maillard reaction taking place. So it's really essential to the product that we're expecting. It needs high temperature and it needs low moisture. And that's ideally what happens in roasting of cocoa. And cocoa beans are roasted a lot. There's a lot of processing that goes into them. They're first of all fermented, dried, roasted, and then those kind of roasted nibs need to be ground and liquefied to be able to form cocoa liquor. So I've got some lovely diagrams to show you here of this kind of process. Yeah, sorry, got a bit to the process. We see how much is involved in the process. So you go from the farming of the cocoa itself, and that's in a big pod, and you've got to get that out. And then you're going to ferment those cocoa beans. You're going to then dry them. Usually you're going to alkalize them as well. So change the pH. It reduces some of the bitterness in the cocoa. And then this stage that I've been talking about particularly is that roasting stage when you get this Maillard reaction occurring. There's some fats in there, of course, as well. So you're also going to get some lipid oxidation and some changes to the fats too. You then take that roasted cocoa and you start to mill it. And that milling stage is really important. And all of that's happened before we've put any of these other things in. So we're then going to change the proportions of the fat and the cocoa so we can make a solid bar. So this cocoa butter and the cocoa liquor, we change the proportions of that. And we add milk and sugar in, usually, certainly if it's a milk chocolate, but if it's a dark chocolate as well, we also add sugar in at this point. You'd think that's it. We've roasted it, we've ground it, we've mixed everything in. Oh no. That's just when the confectioners actually take over. So when I used to work at Nestle Rowntree, the bit for me really started at the conching stage. So we did actually have refiners there as well. But for most people involved in chocolate, the key point then is conching. And that is basically all of that mixture is then a huge tank. It's slowly, basically just moved around and around. And that helps to develop both the texture and the flavour. It's a really crucial stage to chocolate. It's the stage that everybody would like to remove because it takes energy and costs energy to do that. And that's not the final stage. Anytime that you actually see a chocolatier at work, and if you went to a local sort of small artisan chocolate maker, they would be really, a lot of their art would be in the tempering of the chocolate, and the moulding of the chocolate, which I'll mention in a moment too.
Can you go back to fermentation?
Ah.
What does that mean? Because Yeah, well, how do they do that? I can see it's piled up in a box.
Well, yes, I suppose there are other ways of doing it, but it's yeast fermentation. It's a yeast fermentation.
Naturally, or you...
Yes, it does. But I have to say, as I say, I've never been involved in the fermentation bit because we get it after that bit. But it is really crucial, and that happens usually in the country it's coming from rather than here. So yeah, actually it depends. But so yeah, it's the fermentation of the beans actually is what enables us to release some of the sugars and amino acids for later, which are then really important in the flavour development. So it's a crucial stage. Yeah, absolutely. So once we've got the fermented beans, I've already mentioned we go on to roasting, and that's when your sugars and amino acids start to form the Maillard reaction. And then this conching stage, as I've mentioned, it develops the flavour further, but it also actually drives off a lot of undesirable flavours in there. So you actually have things that are just acids, like acetic acid, vinegar, that's effectively there at that point, and you want to drive that off. You don't want that in your final chocolate. So that conching stage, as I say, is very important. So those are the sort of three main stages that would be essential to flavour. And it does go beyond that point because the actual harvesting of the beans, the type of beans and how you ferment them are really important at that early stage. So yeah, so that's all important to flavour. And in terms of texture, I've already mentioned a few of the stages. So the first one is, of course, of the grinding. So you need to take the cocoa nibs that have been roasted and grind those to a particle size that you're not going to feel in the mouth. So you don't want a gritty chocolate, do you? So you need to get that particle size down to less than 40 microns so that it won't feel gritty. And the equipment for doing this is massive. We used to have at Nestle, and they still do use these kind of 5-roll refiners that you can see there. You can't see it particularly well. They're massive steel rollers, and the cocoa paste goes through those rollers, and the gap size gets smaller and smaller to make that, to refine that into a finer and finer particle size. But you can't just throw beans into that. Obviously, you just break the rollers. So you use a milling technique to start with. You mill it, and then you put the paste into the rollers, and that goes round the rollers, and you reduce that particle size further. So that's important. But as I said, the bit that you might have seen done at a more hand scale is actually the tempering stage. So what we're doing with tempering is working on the cocoa butter. So I'm going to talk about cocoa butter, as I said, in a bit more detail in a minute. But it's really important that we get the right crystal structure in the cocoa butter to get the fat crystals to be the correct type, that are stable, they're the right size, and they're the right type, and they seed the rest of the crystals in the chocolate. So it gives the correct crystal network in the chocolate. I'll show you some faults with chocolate in a moment if that's not got right. But if you get that right, you get a nice glossy surface to your chocolate, and you get that proper snap, and it melts smoothly. If you get that wrong, the whole thing goes wrong. So talking of things going wrong, there's two main things that go wrong with chocolate. So have you ever experienced chocolate that's got white on it? Yeah. Okay, there's two reasons for that, and you can tell yourself what's been the problem, if you like. So usually it's either humidity, moisture that's got in, or it's temperature. It's one of those things that's gone wrong. And it's called bloom, and there's two types of bloom. One is sugar bloom, so that's sugar crystals coming out, and the other is fat bloom, which is fat crystals coming out. Basically, if you lick it and it melts, it's fat bloom, and it's usually streaky. It looks more sort of a streaky pattern on it. If it looks more like this sort of network here, that's sugar bloom. No, I've just said it the wrong way around, haven't I? Yeah, no, that's right. So that will dissolve again, but it won't melt when it's warm, so you can't melt it. The tongue wasn't a good example, to be honest, because your tongue obviously is going to make it wet too. But if you warm it and it goes, then it's fat bloom rather than sugar bloom. So you can't you shouldn't be holding chocolate in your corner store where you've got no air conditioning in summer, it's really humid and the temperature's up and down, because what happens then is you buy that chocolate, if worse still, you give it to somebody as a present and they open it and it's all white. It's not going to do them any harm, but it's not a very pleasant texture, as you all know if you've had that type of chocolate. So it's about the conditions that it's been stored in. But in addition to that, what have I got? I have no idea why I've got that on there. Why's a whole series of numbers appeared on my slide? That's really bizarre. I don't know what that is, sorry. Weird. What was I trying to say? Yeah, so the tempering of the chocolate, though, if you get that tempering right, then your fat crystal structure is more stable. So it's going to be more tolerant of these temperature cycles if you've tempered it correctly in the first place. If you don't temper it very well, then it's not going to be very resistant to that temperature cycling. Those numbers are later. Okay, what about the type of milk? So the main differences here really are perhaps continental Europe versus the UK and parts of the US. So milk powder tends to be used directly in continental Europe, whereas what we tend to use in the UK is something called milk crumb, which looks a little bit like that powder on the right-hand side there. And these are kind of just, I guess, traditional reasons that we just did things differently. But this milk crumb is produced by, first of all, dehydrating the condensed. So taking milk, condensing it, dehydrating it. So you've still got that dried milk, but adding cocoa mass into it as well. So you develop this crumb. So the reason for that was when you were getting a sort of seasonal supply of milk in the first place. That was one of the reasons as to why to do this, to make it more stable. So why would it make it more stable? I'm going to come on to these positive compounds in cocoa later. These are the sort of polyphenols, and they're antioxidants. So the antioxidants in that cocoa can help store the milk, basically. It helps to store that dehydrated milk. And so if you didn't have refrigeration, it's going to enable you to use that milk for longer without it going oxidized and kind of off, if you like. But that crumb that processing of the crumb itself then gives it quite a distinct flavour. So that's one of the reasons why UK chocolates can taste quite different to milk chocolate to a milk chocolate, in the rest of Europe. Anyone ever tried Hershey chocolate? Yeah, your face. That's exactly what I think of as Hershey chocolate. It's got a sour milk flavour, hasn't it? And this is historic because basically it was being made with rancid milk to start with. Then that's the flavour that everyone expects, and you like what you expect. So then you have to create that flavour in a Hershey chocolate, and because that's what's expected. Most of us in the UK, it's got quite a popular market now, but for most of us, we're like, it's not what we expect. Okay, back to this tempering then. So I keep talking about tempering. So what is cocoa butter? We need to think about that to start with. So cocoa butter is a fat, which is a triglyceride. So you have a glycerol backbone, as you can see on the top right-hand side there. You've got a glycerol backbone, and attached to that backbone, you've got 3 fatty acids. So triglyceride, 3 fatty acids attached to a glycerol backbone. The fatty acids are predominantly 3. Predominantly, it's just 3 fatty acids. You've got one of them that's unsaturated, that's your oleic acid, and it's about 30%, about a third of the cocoa butter is oleic acid. So that's, when I say unsaturated, you've got, is the glyceride, the one on the bottom of that triglyceride, the fatty acid chain on the bottom there. As you can see, you've got one unsaturated bond. So when it goes, sorry, I know a lot of you are chemists, so I'm sorry for my explanation, but just in case you're not. Some of you are not, that's great, I'll carry on then. So if it goes up, down, pointer, no, that's not going to work, is it? No, you can't, yeah, you can see the pointer, yeah. Oh, it has to be on this one. Yeah, so when you've got a chain that goes up, down, that's carbon with 2 hydrogens on it, and it's called a single bond, carbon to carbon, single bond, couple of hydrogens. And it's really quite stable like that. If you've got a double bond, so that's where you can see it just there, it's a double bond. That means you've got 1 hydrogen less effectively, and you've got a less stable bond between the 2 carbons. So that's what an unsaturated one is. We'll talk about health later. Basically, these unsaturated fatty acids are better for us. So oleic acid, there's lots of it in olive oil. It's that one of the fats that's better for us. And as I've started at a tangent, maybe I'll just go a little bit further down there. When you get polyunsaturated fatty acids like fish oils, that's when they're really much better for you as well. So they're better for our health. And to be honest, these ones that are just the up and down ones with the single bonds, they're saturated fats, and that's not so healthy for us. So cocoa's kind of somewhere in between. It's got 2 saturated fatty acids and 1 unsaturated fatty acid. So it's not the healthiest, but it's not the worst. And most of its triglycerides are either palmitic oleic, so POP, palmitic, I'm trying to use this cursor, it's going on. So palmitic oleic, palmitic is POP, or it could be stearic oleic, stearic, or it could be palmitic oleic, stearic. So it's kind of, those are the main combinations that you get with your cocoa butter. So why did I want to explain that? It's because of this tempering stage. So that's your cocoa butter. The point is, it's not lots and lots of different fats. It's a fairly small number of different ones. And it's got a quite defined crystal structure that then we use. So for cocoa butter, there are 6 different crystal structures. And what we want to get to is this beta 5. The beta 5 one is the one that is the most stable, and therefore it enables us to have this really glossy, lovely chocolate, and that really snaps nicely. So what happens when we're doing that tempering, you can see it, yeah, I think you can see it fairly well on the slide. So you start off with kind of a random crystal structure. You can see it's not linear, it's kind of all over the place. And you seed the crystal. So what I'm terrible for not doing my slides in order. Right, I'm just going to go forward one slide so you can see it practically. What people do to temper chocolate, they get a little bowl of chocolate and they take some of it out and they throw it onto a marble slab like this, which is cold. Bash it around on the marble slab and put half of it back into the bowl again, basically, if you're doing it by hand. The reason they do that, I'll come back to that, but the reason they do that is they're trying to what we call seed the crystals to get the right crystal. So by changing that temperature and controlling it fairly carefully, even on a marble slab, it's fairly carefully controlled. There's the mouse. You start to seed these crystals in this beta form. To start with, it's called beta 3. And then as this seeding process is crystallization goes on, you end up forming, very hard to control the mouse here, you end up forming this beta 5 structure. And what you can see now is a far more linear structure. And once you've got that linear structure, it's much, much more stable. And that's what we need to make chocolate. So this stage of processing the cocoa butter is really important. So as I said at the beginning, the cocoa butter is pretty special in its properties, but if you don't process it properly right the way through, especially including this tempering bit, then you won't have a very good quality chocolate either. So it's not just the quality of the ingredients, it's absolutely about the process as well. So back to the hand-made chocolates on the slab there. So if you are looking at a milk chocolate, it's obviously got milk fats in there. Everything I've been saying so far is all about cocoa butter, as if that's the only fat. But if you're going to add milk fats in there, you're obviously also changing the amount of fats and their melting points as well. So when you actually temper one of these chocolates by hand, you do it slightly differently. And when I used to work in confectionery, the way we used to do this, throw the chocolate onto the slab if you want to temper a small part of it. You've got your little bowl of chocolate, you throw it onto the slab, cool it down to get it seeding just at the right temperature. You put it back in, mix it round. And if you get it right, it's a skill. I never had that skill very well. A proper chocolatier really has that skill. The other thing they used to do is put it on their lip. And if it's the temperature of your lip, it's right, with what they always used to know. And if you couldn't feel the temperature difference, then it could go into the molds. And these guys that do this regularly, I mean, it's an art as well. Obviously, you can do it by controlling the temperature in a processing plant, and you can do it on a big scale. But there's an art to do it when you're a chocolatier as well. And those are the differences. Basically, with a milk chocolate, when you've got different fats in there, you actually have a lower heat. You cool it to a lower heat, and you bring it back slightly to a lower heat as well. And it's to do with the melting point of the different fats. Okay, so that was a bit about the structure and the importance of cocoa butter and tempering in terms of the structure of the chocolate. Oh, come on, mouse. Okay. Oh, go back to this. What about the flavour? So I've said it's Maillard reaction. Well, I'm not going to do a lecture on the Maillard reaction. I did do my PhD on the Maillard reaction. Don't test me on every single pathway today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to jump to what we've got at the end of it. So as I say, you've got sugars and amino acids, you've got high temperature, low moisture. They're your key parts. I'm definitely not going to go through the pathway. I'm just going to give you a glimpse of the flavour in terms of the compounds. So let's think about another alternative you might know. If you thought of vanilla flavour, which is an orchid, isn't it? It's an orchid and you get vanilla pods from it. One of the key compounds in vanilla is vanillin. And to be honest, if you smell vanillin, it smells of vanilla, single compound, nice and easy. Not quite that easy. If there's any experts on vanilla in the room, you get lovely smoky notes from guar and lots of other things in there. But there's a single compound that smells of vanilla. I can assure you there is no single compound that smells of chocolate. Okay, so nothing at all smells of chocolate on its own. We've developed the flavour through the roasting, through the mild reaction, and there are hundreds of compounds. So I'm showing you a piece of work from Schiebele's group in Munich in the States. It's one, we've got a fantastic flavour group in Reading, but I have to say the German group do everything very routinely in the same way every time. So you can pick out pretty much any food you want, and Schiebele's lab have probably done this particular experiment on it, and you can therefore compare things really well. So I'm going to use their work because what they do is they take a food, in this case cocoa it was rather than chocolate, they took cocoa, they extract it, and they look at how many flavour compounds are there, and that tells you nothing. Because your nose is completely different to the GC mass spec. So there are some compounds that are there in huge abundance and smell very little. And then there's other compounds there that, however sensitive your mass spec, are there at a level below detection and your nose is still more sensitive. And that, again, is a bit of the flavour chemistry part of it, is understanding the combination of flavour compounds that make a particular smell. So anyway, so what they do is they extract the food, they get the flavour volatiles, and they can say what's there. And then we literally sit in front of a mass spec with a tube that comes up, we put our nose over it, and we wait for each compound to come through, and then we say what we can detect and how strong it is. And we still rely on that. So that's called odor port, GC odor port. And that's the interaction between the human and the instrument in understanding what is actually perceived. So they do this, but they do it in a very, very specific way. So with this particular cocoa they took, there were 550 volatiles. But in this particular cocoa powder, which was a partially defatted 20% fat cocoa powder, only 35 of those key volatiles were actually odor active. So as each one came through the mass spec, came through the GC rather, before it went to the mass spec, and you've got your nose over it, only 35 of those actually smelt, the others didn't. The most important of those, and by what we, well, the most important is probably arguable, but the ones at the highest intensity of those is what I'm talking about with most important for the purpose of this, to demonstrate. So the strongest compound that came through is called furanyl, sometimes called caramel furanone. You can see the structure of it there. It's a hydroxydimethyl furanone. It's basically got that furanone structure. It's like a well, pentagonal structure, isn't it? With the hydroxyl group on there. So that, you think, well, that's surely really, really important to chocolate. And if that's the strongest smell that comes out, then it must be really important to chocolate. We get it in tomatoes, pineapples, and tuna fish, and pretty much most things that we analyse has got furanyl in it. And if you've got it on its own, it smells candy floss. If you've got furanyl on its own, it's absolutely like going to the fair and having candy floss. So it's kind of what we might say is ubiquitous. It's in so many things. Okay, so next one, what else do we get? Well, a bit of sweat. You would have expected sweat in your chocolate, wouldn't you? So we've got some carboxylic acids, 2 and 3-methylbutanoic acid. They smell of sweat, okay? That's what they smell of. So, but they're really odor active in the chocolate. Where is my chocolate bit? Because now I've got some sulfur. I've got dimethyl trisulfide. Bad eggs. You know, that's kind of cooked egg smell, really. Not still thinking chocolate, are we really? Well, I've got a nice compound now-ish. So ethyl dimethyl pyrazine, it's a pyrazine at least. It's kind of a roasty note now. But on its own, it smells a bit like potato chips. A bit woody, a bit potato chip-like. Still not thinking chocolate. Well, maybe these ones. These are quite nice compounds. 2 and 3-methylbutanol. These are called strecker aldehydes. They're formed directly from an amino acid, really. And they're malty. So now you think Horlicks, they're kind of malty in their notes. So these are, put a bit of malt together with some chips and bad eggs and sweat. And... Okay, I'm not selling it, I know. This compound it's one of my favorite compounds. This compound is beautiful. I've worked on this compound quite a bit. It's 2-acetylpyrroline. It's like it's elusive. It's in your basmati rice or your jasmine rice or your popcorn. It's not very stable when you try to extract it. It does. I think it smells really lovely on its own. It is. It's popcorn, or if you love a basmati or jasmine rice as opposed to a normal rice, it's that compound you like. It's really almost solely acetylpyrroline. And then some of the phenyl acetaldehydes. So these particular acetaldehydes and phenyl acetic acid, these compounds are kind of honey-like on their own. So I suppose if you put all that lot together, you're beginning to see, well, it might be reasonably present, but you wouldn't have thought on the outset, if I asked you, if you were a flavor chemist that knew nothing apart from what each individual flavor did, you wouldn't expect to go and mix that lot together and that's going to be the smell of cocoa. So this is why a flavor chemist's job and a flavorist's job is quite difficult to understand what it is that's actually creating that lovely flavor. And it's certainly, it's a complex set of reactions that have led to it. Just to move to a little bit of work at Reading. I'm going to talk too long, aren't I? Do a little bit of work that went on at Reading. That's the other side of flavour. And actually, if we're going to put milk into it, surely the milk's going to add quite a bit of the flavour as well. This was a PhD student project with my colleague Jane Parker, sponsored actually by Nestle, where I used to work. Particularly Nestle Rowntree's, and it was now 2018. It's not that long ago, 2018. You'd have thought Nestle would know absolutely everything about milk, wouldn't you? I mean, they've got a whole research centre in Methven, but they were still really interested in the processing of UK milk powders and to what extent that actually contributes to the flavour of the chocolate. So basically what Ashley, the PhD student, found was that the actual manufacturing process of the skim milk powder certainly did alter the flavour profile of the milk powder itself. And it was to do with the concentration of the milk, the heat treatment of the milk and the drying. And that difference within the milk powder, then when incorporated into a model of white chocolate, that did lead to flavour differences in the final product in the white chocolate as well. So it isn't all around the cocoa. It's also around the milk as well. Okay, right. So I've kept you waiting long enough. So I've told you a little bit about the things that affect the texture of chocolate and a little bit about the things that affect the flavour of chocolate. So I thought it was about time you tried some chocolate. So you've got, first of all, just about allergens. You've got two sets of chocolate. The first one is going to be green, purple and blue bowl. For the green, purple and blue bowl. Oh, thank you. Thanks very much. There we go. So yes, we've got that one. The allergens that are in here are milk and soya. Okay, they're all milk chocolates. I'm afraid if you have intolerances or allergies to milk or soya or cocoa, which some people do, then, but it's very rare actually, but they'll have some in the audience, then don't try them. But otherwise, if you'd like to try these and you've got a bit of water as well, what I would like to know from you is a little bit of sensory testing. Which one do you think is the least hard or the softest? Which one do you think is the fastest to melt? And which one has got the least, which one is the least sweet? So see if you can have a go at those. And I'm cheating because I know which one's which, and I'm just hoping it works. We won't do it totally officially. You can taste them in random order you like. And I'm really at this point, I have not done any of this, by the way, Pauline. Thank you. Where are you, Pauline? She's done all of this for us. Thank you. We realised that we've never met before, but through this week of sending each other emails, we've found another sensory scientist that wants to do a bit of tasting here and incorporate it in the talk. Right. Don't think I've pushed the boat out there for you on any really expensive chocolates. We're definitely sticking to mainstream. Oh, that's fine. Good. I haven't lectured for a few weeks. I haven't got a whiteboard marker on. Right, so the front row are well ahead. I can hear them telling me which one's the hardest or the softest straight away. So what do we think? Which one did you think was hard or soft? Which was the softest, do you think? Purple one, yeah. Hardest between the other two? Yeah, maybe the blue one. Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. Fastest to melt? Oh, was it this time? Well, you thought the purple. Okay, not the blue though, was it? No. Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's discrepancy between that, but certainly not the blue one. And so the blue one was slowest to melt. We'll probably agree on that. And then the sweetest. Oh, sorry, which one? Oh, sorry, lowest in sweetness. Which is the lowest in sweetness? Blue one, maybe. Yeah. Okay. So if I told you which three chocolates they are now, let's see if you can work out which one's which. Which one do you think is Cadbury's Dairy Milk? Oh. Absolutely. Yeah, spot on. Which one do you think is Sainsbury's own label? It was the blue, actually, yeah. So the green one is Green and Black's. Green and Black's. Green and Black's milk. Well, ish. Up to 3 maybe. Yeah, so what we do with our students each year, so the reason I chose those chocolates is because when we're training our students on sensory evaluation, we use 4 chocolates usually, and this is data from last year. We tend to use 2 own label ones, Green and Blacks. I usually give them cooking chocolate. I was nicer to you. We didn't give you cooking chocolate, and Cadbury's Dairy Milk. What we're trying to do with the students actually isn't so much around the chocolates at that point. It's particularly trying to understand attributes that vary and how you can do what you've just done by just telling us in a more systematic way in terms of sensory evaluations. How can you train people to really get that accurate each time so that you can really understand differences between products? But
is that different?
It's a bit more bitter, that's all really, and a bit rougher in terms of texture. Yeah, it's quite good actually, that cookie chocolate. Yeah. So you were in terms of the hardness, you said the purple one was the least hard, didn't you? Softest. So that's what normally comes up with the Cadbury's there. Which one was the fastest to melt? Not so sure necessarily the Cadbury's, but you definitely had the sorry, these colours aren't the same, should have said. It's Sainsbury's is yellow here, but you said that the blue one, as far as which is the Sainsbury's one, was slower to melt, didn't you? Yeah. And in terms of the sweetest, so if we look at the diagram over here, this, I mean, it's a complicated diagram, but basically Cadbury's chocolate, if you look at all the words around there, it's more vanilla, it's more mouth coating, it's more caramel-like, it's sweeter, it's milkier, etc. Green and Blacks is usually sort of more roasted, more cocoa-y, and definitely harder. And again, the own label chocolates tend to be duller, and we didn't look at that, but they tend to be duller surface and harder. So you now know some of the reasons why, I guess, which would be the amount of cocoa is going to make a difference. So how much cocoa is actually in there. If you've got more cocoa flavour, more bitter and less sweet. If you are going to put other fats in there, you're going to change what the sort of melting characteristics. If you're just going to use cocoa butter, you're probably going to have a better melt. And then the quality of the chocolate, you might have hoped that the melting might be right with Cadbury's. Whether you like that particular chocolate or not, you'd certainly expect it to probably have the smoothest melt, wouldn't you? Probably they're going to afford more time in the processing, and actually it does take a lot of time and therefore money in the processing. Well done. Lovely little sensory panel there. Thank you very much. Okay, so having got you to just eat chocolate, I'm now going to talk about the negative health implications. And then the positives. All right. And if I can get them out, oh, use this again. There we go. Right. So negatives to start with. Well, obviously I talked about saturated fat and sugar are high. So I better put that in context when I mean high. So in the UK, we, from a nutritional perspective, the public facing kind of easy access bit about nutrition tends to be the Eat Well guide. And a few years ago, they took chocolate off the plate. So here, off the plate is all our treats. So our cakes, our crisps, our chocolate and everything else doesn't actually appear on the Eat Well plate on the basis it's not really an essential food. But let's have a look at Let's have a look at that. Again, it's another argument I could have, but I'll leave it. But let's have a look at what the recommendations are from the World Health Organization then. So our total fat intake should be less than or equal to 30% of our total energy intake. But particularly as our saturated fats, as I said, we need to be careful of. We don't need to be careful of our fish, and we don't need to be careful of our olive oil, really. They're good for us fats. They have lots of important functions, including brain function. They're really important. But our saturated fat shouldn't be too high. It should be less than 10% of our energy intake. So if you were eating 2,000 calories a day, that would be 22 grams of fat. And our sugars, was it 2018? I think the recommendations changed to be free sugared should be no more than 10% of any, or should be less than 10% of our total energy intake, which would be 50 grams of sugar a day. And actually the recommendation really is we should go lower, and we should be really probably at 5% as a whole population. Just getting that balance right. It's not to say we shouldn't be eating some sugar and we shouldn't be eating some fat. Certainly it's not saying that. It's just getting these balances right. So in terms of chocolate then, if we look at milk chocolate to start with, milk chocolate is about 18-20% saturated fat. So I've compared here for you the dairy milk, which you've just tasted. I put Tony's in here. Tony's is quite popular at the moment from its eco perspective, really. It's got a really good, it's not just fair trade logo, but it's quite popular at the moment in terms of its sustainability and eco footprint. Anyway, so I'll put that one on there. So on the top, you've got Cadbury's 18 grams of fat per 100 grams. So it's 18%, saturated fat, 18%, and 56 grams of sugar per 100 grams. Similar, to be honest, in the Tony's. So if you looked at that 40, they're usually, it looks a bit of an odd picture, but they're little dairy, the normal size dairy milk bars are 45 grams. So basically, if you were to eat a whole bar of dairy milk, it's about half your maximum recommended saturated fat and sugar for the day. It's not all of it. And obviously you're going to eat other things. So it's not, depends how you consider that, doesn't it? It's a treat, and it's not going to give you all of your saturated fat and sugar for the day. What about dark chocolate? So dark chocolate is lower in sugar and higher in saturated fat. So I've put up there the Lindt on the left-hand side and the one you were tasting, oh, so you weren't tasting that one, and the green and black dark chocolate on the right. You can see the comparison there, about 25 grams of saturated fat. Oh, I've done that wrong. Sorry, I have an eye on the slide. I apologise. That's fat is up at 40%. Saturated fat is at 25 grams. I'm sorry. And the sugar is lower than in the milk chocolate. So basically, if you ate half a bar of that, which would be the equivalent weight of that little, of the standard size dairy milk, it's about 80% of your saturated fat for the day, but only 30% of your sugar intake. So just to give us an idea. However, there are positives. So cocoa and chocolate are a source of antioxidants, as I mentioned before. And these antioxidants in cocoa have been found to improve antioxidant status. This means in the body, not just the antioxidants there in the chocolate, to reduce inflammation and to correlate with reduced heart disease. So that's all quite positive. In moderation, okay. So cocoa is a rich source, actually, of polyphenols, especially flavonols. So I've put the compounds here. It's particularly catechin and epicatechin. So what's been found is that with eating cocoa and doing an acute study and looking at blood samples afterwards, that those cocoa polyphenols are found in the blood. Unfortunately, the bioavailability can be quite low, and it's dependent on a number of things. So the actual polyphenols that are there and the matrix, and how, again, that means the way that you're having the chocolate. Are you having it as drinking chocolate, just cocoa, a chocolate bar, etc. So what else is in that matrix makes a difference to the absorption. But certainly it has vascular effects. Now, what I mean by that is we do these studies at Reading where it's called flow-mediated dilation. You put something on here, on your arm, and you can actually measure the flow going through your veins, basically. So you can measure differences after an acute study on the actual flow rate through your veins. So what we can find is that there's a positive effect of eating what is effectively a normal portion of chocolate, 25 to 40 grams, but it totally depends on the polyphenol level and the subject group. So often the subject group chosen are not the healthiest adults that are going to be doing that. So some of these studies will be on smokers, for example, and you're more likely to see a positive effect than a group of people that aren't smokers. So, you know, it depends on the particular study. And the other thing we need to therefore remember is that the polyphenols are in the cocoa solids, and that is a lot of processing it goes through, and that processing can destroy those polyphenols. So some of the big chocolate companies like Mars and Nestle do put funding into looking at how can they optimize their process so these polyphenols still actually go through and exist in the chocolate. So work is definitely done on that. And a couple of studies from Reading again. So this one is by our colleagues in psychology. So this is Dan Lamport in psychology. He looks at cognition. And the reason that cognition might be affected by polyphenols is about the blood flow in the brain. So not only are we interested in just measuring our arm, if we get a better blood flow through the brain, it can improve our cognition as well. So he had a study with 98 healthy young adults consuming 35 grams of dark chocolate, or in comparison to a low flavonoid white chocolate bar, and found that verbal memory was assessed at baseline and 2 hours after consumption, and the dark chocolate was associated with better verbal memory. This is word recognition, basically, being able to recall words. So that's quite a nice finding, isn't it? Jeremy at Reading in my department a while back looked at the sort of matrix effect and had a look at, well, what sort of things in the chocolate might be influencing the absorption of those flavonols. He had just 15 volunteers in this case, but you can have small numbers if you're just looking at what basically goes through. If you're looking at a bioavailability study, those sorts of studies with small numbers of people are okay. And it's a crossover study, so everybody came back and did each arm of the study. They were looking at the effect of the sugar type on the bioavailability of cocoa flavonols. And well, first of all, they're looking at time post-consumption and the amount of flavonols that's in the plasma. So you can see 0 time for post-consumption, and then you can look at 1 hour post-consumption. You can certainly see that the flavonols are going into your blood. Okay, so that's a lot. It's 700. That's I can't remember the units now. Sorry, but you've got an obvious spike there in flavonols that are going through into the blood. But the difference between the black bar and the grey bar there is the type of sugar. So actually sugar in the chocolate, actual sucrose, is the higher bar, and maltitol, which is a sugar alcohol, is actually reducing the absorption of that. We think, well, why might that be? So if you know anything about sugar alcohols, they're the ones that have laxative effects. In other words, if you have those sugar-free polo mints and things, you shouldn't eat too many of them. Yeah. So they have a bit of a laxative effect. And so effectively, they're going to take things through the intestine a bit quick. So that's not necessarily a good thing if you've got positive things you want to absorb, is it? You don't want them going through the intestine a bit quick. So that's why probably that effect is there. Okay, I'm probably doing terrible for time. Right, let's go move on. So, right. So my question to you is, do you want us to mess around with your chocolate? All right, so there's 3 ways of looking at this. One, and this is the way that the food research group that I belong to really looks at when we're redesigning things, what are we doing? We get involved with reformulating foods. We also, and so does the industry, obviously, and we can also design new foods instead of reformulating, or we could just look at our whole diets and what we do with it. And so I'm going to go through those 3 things briefly and say, should you think we should reformulate chocolate? So the first one of these is obviously sugar reduction. And we do a lot of work on sugar reduction at Reading. I'm going to take you very briefly through work that's not in chocolates, on biscuits. But the reason is, everything you know about sugar reduction is probably, or the most things that consumers tend to know, is about drinks, isn't it? That sugar levy came in. And what happened after that is that the drink manufacturers were able to respond quickly and take, whether you agree with it or not, take sugar out of drinks and put sweeteners in, because they're liquids. So it's relatively straightforward to get the sweetness profile right, and we will all agree or disagree as to whether we should do it. But it's relatively technically easy in comparison to solids, because if you're going to make a cake and you take sugar out of it, sugar is not just there for sweetness, it's there for the structure as well. And if you take it out, you've got to replace it with something, because even if it wasn't integral to the structure, it's certainly bulking out the actual material. So you can't, if you were to replace sugar in a cake, just literally take it out and increase the flour and do nothing else. You get a completely different structure. So one thing you could do is to replace some of that sugar with fibres. That could have a benefit because you've then got an increased fibre in the product in place of the sugar. And actually, in terms of biscuits, when we've done studies with this, most people don't necessarily want the sugar to be, this biscuit to necessarily be that sweet anyway. Anyway, so if we do that sort of thing and replace sugar with fibres, just one of these diagrams again, the control with the highest sugar in it is on the left-hand side, colours even, smoothness of surface, etc. And the other three are all with different fibres in them, and they're all moving to a product that's firmer and crunchier, etc. So they might be okay, but they're not a direct match. You know, this is, if you want to put a crunchy marketing campaign around it and say it's higher in fibre, fine, but it's not a perfect match for your digestive or your niece biscuit or whatever you normally have. It would be slightly different. We've done the same things with cakes and with other biscuits as well. And because you're changing the sugars, you end up with more reducing sugars, you end up with browner products actually rather than paler products, and you do change the structure. So have we done this with chocolate and chocolate things? Yes, we have. We had all of these projects were with a company called Dumatok, which was basically producing a sugar that was just sugar. It's not a sweetener. It is sucrose. It's normal sugar, but they were changing the structure of the sugar. And by changing the structure of the sugar, enhancing the amount of sweetness that you got for the same weight of sugar. All right. But we still obviously were taking some sugar out because we didn't want it to be sweeter. We were trying to take the sugar out and get the amount of sugar down. So we were basically using their technology with functional fibers to provide the structure and that bulking back. What happened? We didn't publish this one, which is why I've just got my slides here. But well, we got a 45 in a chocolate bar. We got a 45% reduction in sugar, going from 54 grams down to 30. The products were less sweet, and the standard chocolate was preferred. So the FS is the full sugar. On the left-hand side, there 61 to 31 of people preferring the full sugar product. Did anything like this hit the market? So there was a few years ago, and this is 2018, Nestle launched Wowzers, sorry, not Wowzers, what they call Wowsums. So this was the first type of this sugar technology to get into a chocolate and on the market. It's got no sweetness again, and it's a structured sugar again. So it is sucrose, it's structured, basically trying to create a more aerated, porous sugar that, again, you've got you're increasing the surface, aren't you? And you're getting something that melts quickly in the mouth. So it's providing some bulking still, and it's also providing same sweetness. Has it lasted on the market? No. So it's been axed. That was in 2 years later in 2020, lack of consumer interest. Let's see how these things go, because obviously the government policies are trying to drive products to be lower in sugar. But the consumers didn't want their chocolate bar messing around with necessarily. Okay, so you could, if you want to reduce sugar, you could reduce it in the product. You might not get exactly the same product, and people might not want their chocolate messing around with. So another way to go about it is designing new foods. Now, I mention this in particular because, again, the government are putting policies in place to try to reduce our sugar consumption. And we do, as a nation, not about you as individuals necessarily, but as a nation, we do need to reduce our sugar consumption. So another way to achieve treats, I suppose, is not to try to match your dairy milk bar exactly as it is, but actually to go, well, here's a different sort of product that you can have. So design a new food to meet that need, as opposed to just trying to completely match your original one. This could be more sustainable. It can be designed with better nutrition from the start off, and you're not trying to get this perfect match from a product. So are there products like this on the market? And so there are. You've probably noticed that in the last few years, the legislation has been introduced slowly on what are called HFSS foods, so high fat, sugar, salt foods. And this basically limits what's called bog-offs in the industry, buy one, get one free. So when you used to go into a supermarket or shop, you buy one, get one free. That used to be on crisps all the time, on chocolate bars all the time, and on those in high-fat sugar products. So the government is stopping that. That's been slower to, I don't want to go into the politics of it all, I haven't got time, but the other one, which you'll have noticed straight away, is if you go into a big supermarket, you do not get those products at the till anymore. You do in a local convenience store, in your local corner shop, but you don't get them in the till anymore. And that's trying to remove that kind of instant indulgent buy that you weren't impulse buy that you wouldn't normally have. So one of the reactions the industry has to that is to go, haha, so maybe I can design a product that is under those HFSS regulations, and I can still sell my products at the till, and I could give you an offer on those products as well. You could say that cynically, or you could also say, and actually some consumers might want those products that are lower in saturated fat and lower in sugar. So guess what? You've got a second tasting coming up. So let me, the second tasting, we've ended up with 3 products. I only really need 2 of them. So your silver's a bonus, all right? So these products, one of them looks more like chocolate and the other one's obviously different. So the red one looks more like chocolate, and the allergens that are in both of them is milk and soya again. But if there's any, sorry, I should have asked this right at the start. Has anybody in the room got a nut allergy? You have. Are you okay with people around you opening?
Yeah.
You are. I'm so sorry. I should have asked you right at the beginning. That's fine. You're okay with the red one, but don't go opening the gold one. You can have the bonus silver one as well. Okay. So what I'd like you to know about these is, let's do a bit of a consumer study now instead of trying to be like a sensory panel. Just give us, I want to know how much you like them. So a score out of 10 for liking, and which of the 2 do you prefer if you had to choose one or the other? So we often get consumers to give us a liking score out of 9 on a scale. But if you're just shouting scores out, I prefer to do it this sort of strictly dancing way of just give it a score out of 10. So the red one, the one in the red wrapper, what would you give us a score out of 10 for that one in terms of liking? 6? Anything between 3 and 8 there, quite differences, yeah. Let's move to the other one, the one that was in the gold wrapper. What about that one? And consumers are all different. It's marvelous. So 2 to 8 or 9 we had on that one, something like that. A big variation in terms of things you liked. So probably it's not worth me doing a preference. What I could do, hands up if you preferred the red one out of the 2, and hands up if you preferred the gold one. Pretty much half and half, possibly. Yeah, maybe. So those 2 examples, we don't have the type of sugar-free product that I mentioned, we don't have. So the sugar-free products that are still on the market are mainly in Holland and Barrett at the moment. The red one does have maltitol in it, which is but you've only had a small amount of it. You won't all be dashing. So that's no sugar. So there's no sugar in that one. But it has got the sugar alcohol in it. And then on the other one is, of course, the example, so this is effectively the red one is like reformulating to take the sugar out. And the other one is, of course, developing a completely different product. So that one is high in fruit and nuts and has chocolate on the top of it. And it brings it down in its saturated fat, and it brings it down in its sugar so that it's below these HFSS guidelines. But it's not trying to be a chocolate bar. It's just trying to be something different. Yeah. So this is just 2 examples of the way the food industry might go about changing things. Okay, right, I really should finish for you, I'm sorry. So obviously your other way of doing it is to redesign diets altogether, keep your treats in there if you want to, and change your actual diets. And that's the sort of work that we do through co-creation at the moment in different communities, because what you're very aware of, I'm sure, on the news is that the disparity really in the UK population that's growing, and obviously it's worse in other countries, in terms of more disadvantaged communities, and they're being left behind. It's usually people within a more disadvantaged community that are more likely to have a poorer quality diet, that are more likely to suffer obesity, that are more likely to have heart disease. And there's a complex reasons as to why. And obviously we do have a society in which HFSS foods, if you like, if you think about lots of foods that are high in fat, sugar and salt, not just your individual chocolate, but everything, they tend to be cheaper and relied upon. So we do work with different communities. These are some of the communities that we're currently working with. In terms of national data tends to not represent those communities particularly well. So we looked at national data, and then we went back to the communities and said, effectively tried to look at what in their diets did they think they actually ate more of than the average population, and what did they feel they ate less of, and what were their aspirations for change. And I can assure you, the aspiration for change was not to change chocolate, and it probably wasn't yours either. But they did have aspirations to change other products, actually. So actually, savoury snacks, they did have an aspiration to change. And we're working with them on that. We're working with them on actually how to develop sort of high pulse, so high fibre and pulse-based products. There was, different aspirations. But my point with chocolate was there was no aspiration to change chocolate by any community. The different communities had lots of factors in common, like what was actually driving their food choice in terms of stress, multiple demands. They all had a desire to eat healthier foods that would still be cheap and convenient. But there were factors that differed between those different communities as well, in terms of whether they were interested in local produce and whether they were interested in meat alternatives, depending on the actual community. So we're doing that type of work. And I really probably shouldn't finish a talk from Reading without saying we actually have the International GOCO Quarantine Centre at Reading as well. So this is a genetic, it might seem initially odd as to why are we, the quarantine facility, is an international facility, because this is not a cocoa area, it's a temperate climate, but that's exactly why. So the idea of having this genetic resource in Reading is because it effectively, material comes in and it's quarantined, and then material goes out to different countries, and you have got you're reducing the chances of spreading disease by having that quarantined in a temperate climate, whereas in a climate where obviously cocoa grows very well would not be where you want to suddenly end up introducing a new disease. So that's why it's actually in Reading. It sort of minimises the risk of spreading what could be devastating pests and diseases. And with that, I have finally finished with History Now. So thank you for your input to this and going with me on your comments and your input to the tasting. Obviously, I'd like to thank my colleagues in the sensory group, and Jane and Jeremy that I've mentioned, particularly in the flavour group and nutrition group. And I really ought to thank my previous life at Nestle Rowntree for a couple of years, because otherwise I wouldn't actually know the hands-on bit about chocolate that much. Also, at Reading, we are always interested in you as people, and we do lots of things where we are interested in people taking part in things. I know that most of you don't actually live that close to Reading, but if you ever want to know more about something, or you think you might want to volunteer in tasting things or be a volunteer in nutrition, we're always interested. So just email me, l.methven@reading, and I'll try and get back to you. Thank you.
Is long gone, but he used to be having pods.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
That question on fermentation, what they do is quite amazing, really. They take a machete, and they take the pod, smash it open, scrape the contents out, and they just pile it on the ground. And then they take the cocoa leaves and they put them on top, and they walk away and leave it. 17 days, I think they leave it. It just rots. So it's yeast, but it's a wild yeast rot. And that's the beginning, not so much of the flavour production, which it is, but it's also getting rid of that awful bitterness.
Yeah, it's the bitter,
If you've ever had the joy of taking one of those cocoa pods and eating the thing, you think, why on earth did anybody want to eat chocolate? And the idea is they thought it was the tree growing is very weird. It has flowers coming out of the trunk, as well as where you expect flowers and fruits to be. And fruits and flowers are on the tree at the same time. So it's believed that South American people at the time thought it was in some way a god or something religious. So they forced themselves to eat.
Yeah.
Thank goodness they did. That was incredible. Thank you, Lisa. There is so much.
Yeah.
One time in Reading, there was some research where just smelling chocolate produced antibodies that you can detect in the saliva, which was against infection. So you hadn't even consumed it.
Yeah.
And I do know, I thought when I was in Reading, it was 500 volatile. So you found 50 more.
It's always vague, isn't it?
The point was, if you put all those 550 back together again, you still
don't get it to smell exactly the same way. Yeah. Yeah.
Anyone here a chocoholic?
Yeah.
Right, called a drug called Naxo, which if you're a heroin addict, they inject into you and immediately go into cold turkey because it blocks the opiate receptors. If you're a chocoholic, and they inject Naxone into you, you go into cold turkey. So in my day, they hadn't found the opiate molecule, but they know something binding in the receptor.
Yeah. So,
excellent. I'll shut up now. There must be some questions. Right, we'll start at Richard at the back.
It's something that people assume or believe that women and men react differently to chocolate. Have you tested that?
I haven't personally tested it.
If I notice the team I see on the screen before me is almost entirely ladies.
There isn't much in terms of taste sensitive. So there's little bits of all different things around that. So one is taste sensitivity. There's a little bit, but not much evidence that we do differ in our taste sensitivity. So you could also say that, you know, you might argue that more men might drink bitter than women. You might argue that more women might eat chocolate than men. And there might be something around taste sensitivity in that. There are more super tasters that are female in terms of sort of being highly more sensitive, and therefore they might have a greater barrier to bitterness. But it's in comparison to the genetic differences that are below that, I think it's more on habit than anything else. Because in terms of that differences in sensitivity, the more you have of something, well, the more you have a particular taste. So this, whether it's fatty taste, whether it's which there are receptors for, or whether it's salt taste or whether it's sweetness, the more you have of something, unfortunately, but you reduce your expression of the gene for the receptors, so you actually become less sensitive to it because you're having it, because your body's going, well, I've got it anyway, I don't need to keep detecting it. So you down-regulate your genes, and then you've also got genetic differences as well. So I think that the amount you have of something affects your perception of it and affects that. Well, and there's also, as Barbara said, there is also.
I'm a biochemist, and I can tell you that chocolate contains phenylethylamine. And this is one of the reasons why people, when they fall in love, start eating chocolate, because it accelerates the emotion end of you. And when you fall out of love, you eat chocolate to try and make a sort of
yeah. And that's what chocolate was also known to be an aphrodisiac as well originally. Yeah.
And I think that more so in women than men. So
yeah. Yeah. Although that's that's argued from the biochemistry perspective and the way that the tests are actually run to detect the difference as well. Yeah, in terms of behaviour tests. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. It's really interesting. So I have a reformulation question, but not that much sugar. I am lactose intolerant, proven by the whole pile of chocolate in here. And I have tried every lactose-free chocolate going, I think, and decided they're not worth the calories. Is it my, and I'm trying to think why, is it my perceived lack of quality only? Is it just that it's perceived and I'm just comparing it with something else? Or is it that they're actually inferior because lactose has been added, the sugar's been split to a simple sugar, and we process it differently? Or is it just because they're made by lactose-free specialists and not by...
Yeah, I was actually wondering how much of that second bit is true, to be honest, because, yeah, I mean, yeah, unfortunately, it can be a bit of all of those, because it's not a mass market, of course. So you haven't got the amount of time and money that goes into developing chocolate on a huge scale is vast. And the amount that goes into developing the specialist chocolates that is much less, because yes, of course, you're checking if you put lactase in. You're talking about milk chocolate. Of course, you just eat dark chocolate.
And gold, which makes me think of supermarket chocolates.
So they're couvertures, basically. There can be as well, rather than chocolates.
Processing in that sense.
Yeah, but they. So I've never looked at this in terms of chocolate. So you are going to change the sugar in the milk. So milk sugar is lactose. So you're going to change the sugar in the milk. And that is going to have an effect on the flavour of the milk powder that you then produce from the milk. But it's not the major contributor to the flavour of chocolate. So yes, it will have an effect, but I wouldn't imagine it's that major, to be honest. I wonder it's how much effort's gone into producing lactose-free chocolate in comparison to normal, in terms of standard milk chocolate, to be honest.
Find everyone's Can't eat too much chocolate.
What?
So we'll
Yeah, yeah.
It would be easy to use dairy milk and incorporate lactase in the chocolate.
Into the chocolate, yeah.
Which is what they do.
Yeah.
Then you've got the
Yeah.
that is split into what is it, lactase and lactase, and it's absorbed differently and presumably change the taste. But I think a lot of it is to do is they're not chocolate actually. I don't think.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of other reasons, to be honest. I'm struggling to.
you might well be right.
They've not ventured into.
But so the point down the front was where you're actually adding the lactase, and I assume that they're adding it at the milk stage rather than later, because it would be more controllable. But it would make a difference where it's added. Yeah, I'm afraid I don't know. I'm guessing beyond that point.
The other thing is scale, because the scale of the chocolate industry is just unbelievably large. So you probably can get something at the bench scale to work. But then with the lactose, the amount that's going to be sold is going to be on a different scale.
Yeah, I remember my brother worked in a Nestle factory as a shift supervisor, and he said he can't eat any of the creams in Quality Street. That's what they made, and they're in these enormous vats.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is scaled up.
Yeah.
That's a small question.
But I do wonder about when.
I would think on that.
Yeah,
There's
I'm wondering about.
It's not just
Yeah.
you have to eat it.
I think your early slide said that cocoa was around nearly 2,000 years
BC.
before BC.
Yeah.
When did we start eating block chocolate?
Oh, so that wasn't until that was on the slide somewhere, wasn't it?
If you did have it, I missed it.
Yeah, no, it was because the Dutch managed to work. So that wasn't from South America at all. That was the Dutch, which was 1800s, I think, that then were looking at how to express the cocoa powder out of the cocoa, because until you could get that cocoa powder, sorry, the cocoa butter separate, then you were at a loss as to how to produce a proper solid bar. It's a long time later.
I think Bristol boast that they were the first mass producers.
Yeah.
In 1880, I think.
Yeah,
Quite
yeah.
relatively.
Yeah.
Did your chart suggest early on that there was no cocoa butter in milk?
Yeah, no, it's not. I think it's, but it's not a legislative. There is, yes, absolutely. It's very important. I'm not sure there's a legislative minimum. Yeah, that was all. Yeah.
Is there a question on this side? Yeah, here we go.
Well, it is my impression that Cadbury's dairy milk chocolate is addictive. I can't stop eating the bar, so I've got to eat it entirely. I suspect it is designed that way.
And
Excess sugar, perhaps.
the sugar levels, I was trying to remember what they are quite high in dairy milk versus other, but I don't think the sugar level so high in milk chocolate that I don't think one dairy milk over another would be the reason that it might be more addictive. So Barbara mentioned the addictive phenylalanine in there earlier. There is also something else around the reward and also the cue for the reward. So and what I mean by that is Cadbury's milk chocolate has kind of got a almost a rose note to it. Do you know, like a Turkey that you get in Turkish delight, like that it's subtle, but it's there in Cadbury's and it's not there in other milk chocolates. So that's almost a cue. So nearly everybody knew which was the Cadbury's straight away. And if I'd not even asked you the questions, you might have spotted the Cadbury's straight away. It's so familiar. So you can spot that flavour profile against other milk chocolates. So to be honest, it might be the cue of that plus the addictive part of it, and then the two are linked. So you know when you have that, and it's linked to the addictive part. Which
so you're saying Cadbury chocolate as against any other chocolate you eat, it's Cadbury you want rather than chocolate in general.
I prefer others.
You prefer?
Oh, you prefer others though?
Well, chocolate has, I said phenylethylamine, but it's also got something that works on the cannabinoid system.
Yeah.
So it's got a material which binds to the cannabinoid, so THC receptors basically. So there's a lot of things, a lot of active biochemical molecules in there that you would be attracted to and are addictive in other worlds. So chocoholics are addictive. But if you ask them to stop, so you're in that category, yes. So cut down. It makes you feel good and your fatty acid profile isn't too high.
Yeah, yeah.
Why not?
Just
Just one little last question. I just wondered if they companies modify their recipe for export to other climates around
Yes.
the world.
Yeah.
So you go to India and you can still get your cabbage, but it tastes different.
Yeah, but it will do, because you've got to get that. It's because of the room temperature changes. The main reason, so you know, we've worked with companies, not at the moment. We've worked with Strauss in Israel before now. That this is so much of a hotter climate that you've got to reformulate to not end up with all your chocolate melted. To be honest, yeah. So it is definitely different depending on the climate. Yeah.
Will be different and
Yeah, no, there'll be differences because
they're not localized there.
Well, there's certain parts of it that are actually as well, certainly the cocoa. But the milk supply would be very different. You're not going to, so that's true as well. Yeah, you're back to this milk supply business. Yeah.
It's amazing how globally people chocolate. I think when I used to do a lecture, there was only 5% of people who didn't or couldn't eat chocolate. Whereas if you look at something like milk, it's 20%. So it's universally liked. If you look at the consumption in the UK, in the 1600s, it was in Samuel Pepys' day in the coffee houses, it was low, but it continued on a linear increase. Even during the wars, where it leveled off a bit, they still managed to import chocolate abroad. So it's desperate to get hold of chocolate. So maybe that addiction argument is stronger than we realise. I don't think it's another food like it, is it? Even sugar, it's not.
It's not. It's the well. That's not you can have receptors, is it? In the same way. So, yeah. We do have Claire Williams working on cannabinoid receptors, thinking about it. I don't know how much work she's done on chocolate at Reading.
Well,
yeah.
We've got cannabinoid materials that can sit in the receptors.
Yeah.
Next question.
I understand that in certain occasions that chocolate is a stimulant and you shouldn't actually have it late in the evening.
Oh, that's the caffeine in there, dominantly. Yeah.
It is caffeine.
Yeah.
You didn't mention caffeine.
I didn't mention caffeine. Sorry about that.
You
yes.
did.
No, I didn't. No. Yes. Yeah. No, there's caffeine in chocolate as well. Yeah. Yeah. And it'll be higher in your dark chocolate just because of the later.
Mug of hot chocolate isn't necessarily the best way to send you to sleep.
Well, you're not using it, so it's not going to be so high in that because it's in the cocoa liquor and the dark chocolate part of it. So your cocoa solids in your, depends what hot chocolate you have at night, but actually if you have it the way I produce hot chocolate, it's got a lot of cocoa solids in it. Your Cadbury's hot chocolate milk, milk hot chocolate blend, that's not actually that high in cocoa solids, but you're right, yeah. Yes, yeah.
You've got three molecules, you've got theobromine, caffeine, and theophylline. Tea is mainly theophylline, isn't it? Coffee is obviously mainly caffeine, and cocoa is mainly theobromine.
And caffeine.
Theobromine is a drug. It will open up the lungs so that you can breathe easier. So asthmatics will take theobromine. So you have slightly different. So it is a very potent food.
But then open your lungs before you go to sleep, and that's quite good if you've got chest problems.
I struggled with the mouthfeel part of the test, because my favourite molecule in the buccal cavity is PMMA, polymethyl methacrylate, but I promised my wife that I wouldn't take it out to show you. In other words, it's a dental plate.
Yes.
That makes a difference.
It makes it quite a, do you think the tongue or the roof of the mouth is more important for deciding about your mouth feel?
Mouth feel, both, because as long as your surface of your tongue's not covered, then your taste receptors are still working fine, aren't they? You still get a taste perception. So there's a lot of work now looking at when you push your tongue up to your hard palate and move a food and move that in this case chocolate around, then how much friction does it actually cause? And that being related then to how much you perceive the mouthfeel. Now you've got your receptors for that. Your mechanoreceptors are all over the oral cavity. They're not just on the tongue. But I think it's two things. So one is the actual receptors for that friction, that change. But the other is the way that your tongue pushes against the hard palate and moves the food will be slightly different. So your experience will be slightly different with a plate in than it is without, for sure. And also the roughness of a natural hard palate versus the smoothness of a plate is quite different. So that it'll slip, if you like, across a plate, which it doesn't slip in the same way. So it is definitely going to be, and that's so the whole melting and then the flow. So it's like trying to put something through a pipe and then look at the friction of that through the pipe. The flow properties will be quite different, actually. So the mouthfeel is actually different, and it's the actual physical flow properties will be different, and the way that you perceive it. So yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So
yeah,
best advice for the alcoholics is, or
chocolate.
get yourself a dental plate.
So,
Yeah,
Richard, do we
I'll argue with that.
Underneath Father's dental surgery was where these were made when I was 13-year-old.
Yeah.
Yeah, he called it Massachusetts. Sorry.
Right. So, do we have any questions? No, that's it. Well, look, thank you very much. Come on.